Okay, a few other speciation uh, issues to talk about up here at the top. Niche isolation is something to consider. It happens where animals that live in the same general area, but the key is they live and mate in different microhabitats. Microhabitats are small subdivisions of larger habitats. Like, for example, a bat may never run into a crayfish, even though they both live in the same acre of land near a stream. So even close relatives that are actually living in different microhabitats, different species of are I should say members of the same species of frog can easily find themselves evolving separately than frogs in their immediate region because of just minor microhabitat differences in the same basic large region. So in areas like in the northern United States where you have the prairie potholes, which are little ephemeral pools, ephemeral meaning they're small bodies of water that dry up when the spring rains end. Those ephemeral pools represent small isolated pockets of frog reproduction in the spring. It's possible for frogs in adjacent ephemeral pools to evolve differently because of microhabitat differences. Parthenogenesis is something worth mentioning. Parthenogenesis happens in some animals where females, all animals are female, and the species reproduces from unfertilized eggs. It's thought to arise probably through polyploidy, which is exceedingly rare in animals because of the problem with embryonic development. But this lovely lizard, rather large lizard, I've actually seen them on hikes in the Southwest. That's called a chuckwalla. That is a lizard that is entirely parthenogenic. They reproduce by laying fertile, unfertilized eggs. That's rare, but it does happen. It is certain that the chuckwalla probably arose from a freak parthenogenic event. It's understood that Komodo dragons sometimes do the same thing, that they do occasionally produce offspring immaculately, meaning no male sperm. The female's eggs simply grow into um, offspring. So pregnancy occurs without conception. So it's kind of odd, but that is unusual. Now, if you have also, there's one other characteristic of speciation to mention before we move on. Introgression is where two species are evolving separately and then they get introduced back together and they introgress. This may happen to polar bears and Alaskan grizzly bears. Uh, they have found pizzly bears, which are hybrids between polar and grizzly bears. Those have been found in northern Alaska. Polar bears normally don't run into grizzly bears because the polar bears are out on the ice and they're only at the mainland to actually spend part of the summers. And the grizzly bears, on the other hand, are in the Alaskan interior. But now that polar bear ice is disappearing, polar bears are running into grizzly bears and they're actually reproducing, and the two species may introgress into one species, which would be kind of sad in the case of the bears. Now, as populations evolve in different directions due to an allopatric event or a sympatric event, if they get mixed back together again, the idea is that prezygotic or postzygotic isolating mechanisms should keep them apart. If they don't, if they're not kept apart, they'll introgress back into one species again. So every life form on the planet is in a state of evolution at the moment, evolving away from its closest relative and potentially running the risk of introgressing back with its closest relatives should they get thrown together in the same area. We've already talked about these, but when you look at related species, homologous structures are structures that obviously have the same internal anatomy, but they may be used differently by different species. The human arm has a slightly different use than a dog arm, but the bone structure or theme of bone structure is very similar between the two, and that goes for the bat and the whale. So in all of these animals, there's an upper arm bone, which is the humerus. There are two wrist bones, which are the radius and ulna, and then there are I should say forearm bones are the radius and ulna, and then there's wrist bones, which are the carpals. That's in yellow. And then there's metacarpals and phalanges make up the brown structures that you see there. That's homology. Analogy, on the other hand, you will see when you're considering, well, now is a bird wing homologous to an insect wing? When you look at the internal structure of the two wings, it becomes quickly obvious that they did not have a common ancestor. The wings were invented separately, and they obviously are both for flying. Those are called analogous structures. So in the hodgepodge of evolutionary patterns we see on Earth, you see a lot of homologies, which are always revealed through careful analysis of anatomy, and analogies, which are superficially similarly functioning organs, but internally they are entirely different, showing a completely different origin and pattern of evolution. Now, evolution has not stopped because we're talking about it. Populations are still evolving, and we see the most rapid evolution is in viruses like AIDS and influenza. New bacterial strains are appearing all the time. Every time a new antibiotic hits the market, it will probably only be effective for less than a decade, and mutations will arise that will allow bacteria to grow in the presence of that antibiotic. So this is, for example, a map of the H1N1 influenza outbreak in 2009. You'll notice the gray regions are areas where influenza was not a problem, and the orange regions is where influenza was a problem. The reason influenza was not a problem here is because these are poorer areas of the world, and no influenza infected people reach those areas and spread it. These folks are widely spread out. On the other hand, in the Middle East regions here, in Asia here, Australia here, and in the Americas, you see lots of H1N1 cases in orange, and that's because population densities are much higher and influenza spreads rapidly from host to host. So populations are constantly evolving. Virulence is an artifact of this constant evolution, and medicine is virulence is the ability of a pathogen to infect and make ill its host. Virulence is constantly on an evolutionary rise. We push it back with an antibiotic, and then it comes back as evolution proceeds and mutations occur to allow organisms to survive and reproduce despite selective pressures. Now, there's a few other patterns of evolution on Earth that are worth talking about. Coevolution is one of them. There's been a lot of coevolution on Earth. You've co-evolved with the bacteria in your digestive tract. They keep you happy, you keep them happy. But coevolution has been a huge boon to the evolution of animal and plant life on Earth. Humans co-evolved with wheat and corn most recently. That's supplying our food for our food chain. We've got a couple of evolutionary stories here that are really worth talking about. One of the most well-known ones is butterflies and flowers. For coevolution, this is the most prominent. Butterflies and flying insects have evolved to pollinate flowers. Flowers would go extinct without their pollinators. The flowers feed the butterflies a treat, and the butterflies in return get nectar to eat, but also pollen rubbed on their legs. When they visit the next flower, they will pollinate the next flower, and thus reproduction of the flower occurs. The flower is helping the butterfly reproduce because it's feeding it. The coevolution of insects and flowers has been one of the most remarkable coevolution stories on Earth, but there's other examples. There are birds known as honey creepers in Hawaii. Honey creepers are going extinct because of invasive species in Hawaii, but honey creepers are birds like hummingbirds, but larger, that are capable of hovering, and they pollinate orchids in Hawaii, which are endemic to Hawaii and only found there. Honey creeper, orchid, coevolution is a story of Hawaiian evolution. Smallpox in Europe was a story in human evolution. Smallpox co-evolved with humans in Europe, and what that meant was, even though a lot of Europeans died from smallpox, it ended up allowing them to move around the world and not meet much human resistance. Smallpox killed more Native Americans than all the guns and bullets that the Europeans brought. Because Europeans had evolved with smallpox, it's not nearly the lethal disease to a European. So 10,000 years ago, when smallpox was killing humans in Europe, it was very lethal. But since smallpox killed all the vulnerable people that were in Europe, all of the descendants of the survivors were naturally resistant to smallpox. Smallpox in Native America wiped out the Native Americans. If the Native Americans had a chance over a period of 4,000 years, they would have bounced back from the smallpox and they would have been smallpox resistant. But the Europeans reached America, brought smallpox, and the smallpox killed over 90% of some tribes of Native Americans because there was no resistance. There is a famous coevolution of acacias and ants that's worth knowing about. Acacias are legumes, they're big trees that actually have ants that protect them. The ants actually eat any animals that feed on acacia, and they will attack any large mammals that feed on the acacia. Giraffes will come and eat a few leaves, but then they can't handle the stings from the ants and they move on. Without the ants, the acacia will die because elephants and giraffes will eat them up along with other insects. And without the acacia, the ants would have a hard time because they would lose their habitat. The acacia actually feeds the ants sap, as well as giving the ants a place to nest and grow and find other prey insects. So that is a rather famous example of coevolution on Earth.